Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're plunging into something incredibly foundational, really, for one of the world's largest democracies, its constitution. Our mission in this deep dive is to explore some fundamental critiques of the Indian Constitution. We're drawing from Dr. Ryan Baidya's book, A New Democratic Republic Constitution for India. It's quite thought-provoking.
It really is. And what's fascinating here is how these sources dig deep, like right into questions about the Constitution's core values, where it came from, and, how it actually plays out on the ground.
Exactly.
It's a document most people, I think, just accept. But given its role for India, looking under the hood like this, it feels pretty crucial.
Absolutely. So the source material for this deep dive comes from several chapters 13 through XX of Dr. Baidya's book.
Right.
These chapters offer a really critical perspective on various aspects. Our goal is just to distill the core arguments, the insights, help you understand some complex points without getting, too bogged down.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Let's start right at the beginning. The Preamble.
Okay.
The very first words declare India a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. And it opens with such power. We, the people, adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution.
That phrase itself signifies so much.
It really does. That power vested in the people.
And this ties directly into Chapter 13, which actually gets into the naming of the country itself.
Ah, the India versus Bharat question.
Exactly. Both the Preamble and Article 1 use both names. Article 1 specifically says, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states.
That dual naming is interesting. So you have India mainly for international stuff, treaties and the like.
Generally, yes. That's the common distinction.
And Bharat more for domestic use, maybe official communications within India.
That's the idea, but the source argues it's not quite that simple.
Oh, so it's not just a practical distinction. Could that duality actually create, tension or complications?
Well, that's precisely what the sources highlight. It suggests it goes beyond just preference.
How?
For instance, the book points to potential ambiguity in international agreements. Does everyone understand this duality? Maybe not always consistently reflected.
Okay.
And then there are potential legal and administrative inconsistencies internally. Different names on government documents, institutional names. It can get messy.
Right.
And finally, public perception. The source notes that for some, Bharat feels more culturally significant, more historical, while India is seen as maybe more contemporary, more global.
So it's not just semantics. The source suggests this dual naming actually exposes a deeper tension, like between India's global identity and its indigenous roots.
That's the core insight presented, yeah. It forces you to think about how you reconcile those things in one foundational document.
That's a powerful way to put it. So what does the book suggest? Any proposed solutions to this tension?
Well, a few things are mentioned. A constitutional amendment, perhaps, to pick one name or clearly spell out when each is used.
Okay, make it official.
Or develop really clear usage guidelines for official documents. And importantly, more public education about the history and significance of both names, trying to foster a unified identity around it.
It's a lot to consider just from the names. It really shows how deep these foundational elements go.
Mm-hmm.
Building on that, the book then dives into Chapter 14. This one's really provocative. It's about the perils of adopting colonial constitutions.
Right. This chapter's central idea is that basing a nation's constitution on its former colonial ruler's legal framework, well, it can actually perpetuate ideological subjugation.
Even after independence.
That's the argument, that it prevents true freedom, true self-determination, even if you're physically independent.
Wow, that's quite a claim. It almost makes me think of, how people follow ancient religious codes sometimes just because they define their identity, maybe without fully understanding the origins. Here, it's the constitutional codes defining national identity.
It's a similar kind of idea presented.
And the sources specifically mention the influence of the Government of India Act of 1935, right? A British law.
Yes, a huge influence. And it notes how the framers, many educated in British institutions, were naturally steeped in those British legal traditions.
So this influence, according to the source, creates what it calls a pseudo-dominion status.
That's the term used, yeah. Physically independent, but ideologically still linked, still sort of operating within the former powers framework.
Which leads to a call for more indigenous constitutional frameworks.
Exactly, to really break free from those historical legacies. That's the core argument.
That's a deep point. So we've got the name carrying historical weight, the foundation possibly carrying colonial imprints. Which brings us to chapter 55. An even more fundamental question the book raises. Was this Constitution truly by the people? The argument presented is that it was framed by a constituent assembly, not directly approved by, say, a referendum. No direct popular vote.
And that's a crucial point the source digs into. It talks about indirect representation and limited franchise. Meaning the constituent assembly members were elected, yes, but by provincial legislative assemblies.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. The electorate for those assemblies, it was restricted based on things like property, education, tax status.
So not everyone could vote for the people who chose the framers.
Not even close. The source estimates only about 10 to 15% of the population was eligible, which meant huge sections, many women, lower castes, the poor were just excluded from that initial process.
So unlike some countries that put their constitution to a direct vote, India didn't have that. The book calls this a democratic deficit, right? And highlights elite dominance in the process.
That's the term used, yes. Now, it does acknowledge the Constitution has been upheld, amended, worked with through democratic means since then, for decades.
Sure.
But this point raises that question about its initial legitimacy, about direct public approval right at the very start, given who was and wasn't involved.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to chapter 16. This one highlights what it calls a significant historical and maybe legal discrepancy right in the preamble itself.
Yes, the dates and the wording.
Exactly. It explains the original preamble was adopted November 26, 1949.
Right. But here's the twist the source points out. The words socialist, secular, and integrity, they weren't in that original 1949 version.
They were added later.
Much later.
Right.
By the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. During the emergency period under Indira Gandhi, which was itself controversial.
Okay, so the discrepancy is the current preamble still has the 1949 adoption date at the bottom.
Correct,
Yeah.
even though those key words were added in 76.
And the book's take on this?
It describes this as creating a misleading impression. It actually goes so far as to call it a legal forgery.
That's a very strong claim.
It is indeed a very pointed critique of how that history is presented in the document itself.
So what's the proposed fix, according to the source?
A few ideas. Annotated versions of the preamble, maybe, that show the changes. Explicitly documenting amendments. Public awareness campaigns. Or even revising the preamble text to clearly state, adopted on this date, amended on these dates.
Making the history transparent, basically.
That seems to be the goal of those suggestions.
All right, moving on to chapter 17. This one presents another really interesting argument. That despite the word socialist being right there in the preamble.
Added in 1976.
Right. The argument is that the Indian Constitution, in practice, might not truly embody a socialist state. That seems like a major contradiction, doesn't it? How does the book unpack this?
It's a key argument. The book essentially explains that India operates much more like a mixed economy. There are significant capitalist elements.
Like what?
Well, the sources cite the substantial private sector involvement. For one, market-driven principles playing a big role, and especially the post-1991 liberalization and privatization policies.
The economic reforms.
Exactly. Those reforms saw a pretty significant reduction in the state's direct control over the economy. The argument is that this diminished the state's socialist character in practice.
And the book also mentions, I think, that despite the socialist ideals in the text, India still faces huge wealth inequality.
Yes, significant and growing inequality. Unequal access to basic services like education, healthcare for many.
And the private sector dominating key areas. Regulatory environment favoring market solutions.
All highlighted as reasons why, in practice, the source argues India doesn't fully align with that socialist label in the preamble.
It really makes you wonder then, is the word socialist more of an aspiration or maybe even a misnomer now, given the reality on the ground?
That's precisely the question the chapter seems to pose, which actually leads us quite naturally into Chapter 8's contention.
Let me guess. Something about democracy.
You got it. The argument that the Indian Constitution is not democratic in its true sense. Again, focusing on practical application.
Okay. How does the source back that up?
Well, one major point discussed is the electoral system. First past the post, or FPTP.
Where the candidate with the most votes wins, even if it's not over 50%.
Exactly. The source argues this often results in disproportionate representation. Parties can win a solid majority of seats with sometimes only 30–40% of the popular vote.
So the government might not actually represent a majority of voters.
That's the concern raised. And, of course, the prevalence of money and muscle power in elections is also noted as undermining the democratic spirit.
Right.
Plus, the absence of proportional representation where seats match vote percentages more closely means many votes effectively feel wasted. They don't contribute to the legislature's composition, potentially marginalizing smaller parties or minority viewpoints.
So this raises that question. Does the system truly reflect the will of all the people?
That's the core question, yes.
The sources also touch on other issues, right, like political dynasties.
Yes, political dynasties, widespread corruption are mentioned, also the centralization of power, sometimes very strong central governments potentially undermining state autonomy, which affects the federal structure.
Okay. What else?
There's also an argument about weak institutional checks and balances. Instances where institutions, maybe the judiciary or media, seem influenced by political pressures, which hinders accountability. And then there are restrictions on civil liberties. Freedom of speech, assembly, the use of certain laws is highlighted.
Like UAPA?
Yes, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, criticized for broad definitions, tough bail conditions, and the National Security Act, the NSA, allowing preventive detention. These are cited as potentially undermining democratic freedoms.
And there was something else about discrimination.
Yeah, persistent discrimination issues, but also the source mentions a feeling of reverse discrimination among the majority, attributed to what it calls uneven policymaking, a complex picture of practical challenges to the democratic ideal.
Okay, so that covers democracy. Let's move to Chapter 19. Here, the book argues that the Indian Constitution, in its current form, has failed to maintain a truly secular state.
Another strong claim.
It starts by defining secularism, right? Separation of religion and state, equal treatment, freedom of religion, the usual benchmarks.
Yes, and then it presents several arguments for why, in practice, India falls short, according to the author.
What are the main points?
One key point is the existence of personal laws based on religion.
So different laws for marriage, inheritance, etc., for Hindus, Muslims, Christians.
Exactly. Instead of one common civil code for everyone, the Uniform Civil Code is mentioned in the Constitution's directive principles, kind of like goals.
But it hasn't been implemented.
Right. And that lack of implementation is a major point of critique in the source.
What else? State intervention in religion.
Yes, that's highlighted. Specifically, government control over many Hindu temples through the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act, the HRCE Act.
Which allows state governments to manage temple funds and administration.
Correct. And the source contrasts this with the independent management of most mosques and churches, arguing its unequal treatment.
Unequal state involvement.
That's the argument. Also mentioned are things like Article 30, giving minorities special rights for educational institutions. Historical examples like the Hajj subsidy for Muslims are cited. Religious quotas in some institutions, all presented as examples where the state might not be entirely neutral between religions.
So if you connect the dots, the source argues this creates a system of uneven treatment by the state, not true secular neutrality.
That's a picture painted, yes. A system where the state interacts differently with different religious groups.
The book also mentions politics, right? Exploiting religion for votes.
Political exploitation of religion. And specific judicial interpretations or legislative actions, like the Shah Bano case override.
Where Parliament overturned a Supreme Court ruling on maintenance for a divorced Muslim woman after religious pressure?
Yes. That's cited as another instance where secular principles were arguably compromised.
Does the source list specific articles?
It does. It explicitly lists articles cited as potentially favoring certain groups. Articles 29, 30, 341, 342, 25(2)b, mentioned in relation to Muslims and Christians. Articles 25(2)b, 26(2)90a for Hindus, and Articles 15, 16, 25(1) for non-religious groups.
So it's quite detailed.
Yes. The core argument presented is that a government distributing state resources or managing religious affairs based on religious considerations fundamentally contradicts true secularism.
Okay, this brings us to the final chapter we're covering, Chapter XX. And this one tackles a particularly sensitive, often debated topic, the marginalized majority.
Right.
Now, it's really important we reiterate. We're presenting the author's arguments from the source material here. We're not endorsing them, just outlining what the book claims.
Absolutely. It's crucial to be clear about that.
The claim in this chapter is, well, it posits a systematic marginalization of the majority Hindu population and a disproportionate empowerment of minority communities, specifically Muslims and Christians, particularly under Congress governments from 1950 to 2014.
It's a very direct assertion made in the book.
Let's unpack the specific examples the book uses to support this claim.
Okay. The sources provide several. Article 25, guaranteeing religious freedom, is argued to actually facilitate conversions away from Hinduism.
Okay.
Then there's a comparison between Article 28, which prohibits religious instruction in state-funded institutions, mainly impacting Hindus, and Article 30, which grants minorities the right to establish and run their own religious educational institutions, sometimes with state aid.
So, an alleged imbalance in religious education rights.
That's the discrepancy highlighted.
Yeah.
And then there's the HRCE Act again, the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act of 1951.
We mentioned that under secularism.
Yes, but here it's framed specifically as putting Hindu temples under government control, leading to alleged mismanagement and depriving Hindus of religious autonomy, while the argument goes, mosques and churches remain free from similar state control.
The book points to this as a major imbalance affecting the majority community.
That's the claim. The 1975 insertion of secular into the preamble during the emergency is also cited again.
But arguing its implementation has been skewed.
Yes, skewed against the majority, according to this perspective. And specific laws passed later are mentioned.
Which ones?
The Minority Commission Act of 1992 and the Places of Worship Act of 1991.
The one that generally freezes the status of religious sites as of 1947.
Correct. These laws are presented in the source as allegedly institutionalizing an imbalance and restricting the ability of Hindus to reclaim religious sites they believe are historically theirs.
So based on these points, the chapter calls for pretty significant reforms.
Yes. Constitutional and legal reforms. Things like redefining secularism to ensure it applies equally to all communities without special provisions.
Removing laws like the HRCE Act.
That's one call, yes. Ensuring Hindus have the same rights to religious education as minorities under Article 30. And re-examining the Walk Act of 1995.
Which deals with Muslim religious properties.
Yes, to ensure, the argument goes, that it doesn't infringe on the property rights of others.
So the overall argument here is about achieving cultural preservation and legal parity.
Essentially, yes. Ensuring Hindu institutions are free from state interference, according to the source, and that all communities are subject to the exact same laws, without perceived special treatments or disadvantages based on religion. That's the perspective laid out in this chapter.
Wow. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground. A really comprehensive critique presented across these chapters of Dr. Baidya's book. From the preamble's accuracy, the dual naming, right through to the practical application of socialist, democratic, secular principles, and finally this perspective on the marginalized majority.
It's a lot to process, definitely.
It really is.
In essence, what the sources highlight is how the Indian Constitution, despite being this foundational document, faces, from this author's perspective, significant challenges in its constructs, its structure, its actual implementation on the ground.
Leading to these calls for reevaluation, or even a complete rewrite.
Yes, calls for significant change to foster what the author presumably sees as a more cohesive and equitable society. That's the takeaway from the critique presented.
So, reflecting on all this, what stands out to you listening to this? Given these varied critiques, these proposed reforms seem quite radical. What truly defines a nation's identity? And maybe the bigger question, how can a constitution best serve the aspirations of all its people in a world that's changing so rapidly? Something to think about.